A date which will live in infamy.
It's Yakov and the Daf Yomi. Both of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugereicht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Izhbitzer.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Welcome, everyone, to Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Geber with another episode of Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been generously sponsored by the Glenner family in memory of Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov Morgenstern, who was born on July 26, 1917, to Rabbi Rav Meir and Esther Morganstern. He was a ben achar ben, 6 generations from the Kotzker Rebbe of Menachem Mendel Morgenstern. Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov survived the Holocaust, being in 12 different concentration camps. In 1944, at the end of the war, he was on the death march from Natzweiler, a concentration camp on the border of France and Germany, back to Dachau. He was liberated in Dachau by the Americans on May 7, 1945. Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov kept his parents alive in the Warsaw Ghetto because he would go out to look for food and bring it home to his parents so his father wouldn't have to risk his life by going out. He was clean-shaven, and the Nazis targeted Rabbanim with a beard for extra cruel sport. One day his father, Rav Meir, turned to him and said, "Mein Kind, you're mekayim the mitzvah of kibbud avim k'moishe kasav b'Torah." Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov never forgot this. It made a major impression on him. Unfortunately, in the summer of 1942, Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov's parents, Rabbi Rav Meir and Esther, and his sister Rachel Brandel were sent to Treblinka and perished there the same day they arrived. Many years later, his daughter asked her father why he survived the war. He answered her, "There was no reason for me to survive the war. I survived the war only because Hashem wanted me to survive. I became a greater maimon after the war than even before the war." However, if I had to give a reason, it was because of the kibbud avim to my parents. And that brings us right in a beautiful introduction to this Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov Morgenstern's ancestor, the Kotzker. And spoke last year about the Kotzker, but there's so much more to speak about him and how appropriate it is for a descendant of a Kotzker to bring us back to that world of the mid-19th century in the world of Kotzk. And we're going to speak a little bit about Ishbitz and the split between Kotzk and Ishbitz. Before we get to that, I want to read another few letters that I received from both the Simchas Rieger recent episode as well as the Chernobyl recent episode. Someone submitted about the Simchas Rieger, the Dayan of Brisk episode, which we had recently, in a funny joke story. I don't know what to call it. Here it goes. In Europe, they used to say tongue-in-cheek that every suffix in halacha is really a sfeika. Number one, there's the suffix itself. And number two, there's always the possibility that Reb Simcha Zelig would be matir. So that's a cute addition to Reb Simcha Zelig's way of paskening shilas. We get back to the Chernobyl episode, part 2 specifically. I mentioned something that I think was misunderstood, probably because I didn't make myself clear, so I take responsibility for that. I spoke about Hasidic dress, and I mentioned how there are those who cynically see it as related to the weather conditions and the mud and the snow of the locales of Eastern Europe. And I meant to say it, and I thought I did, in a very general sense, not specifically about Skver and not specifically about Chernobyl. I was speaking in general about Chassidus. I think I even specifically mentioned Ger and other groups, that it's something that is said in a very general way. Apparently, I didn't make myself clear, and many thought that I had meant that this was the reason, specifically that in Skver they wear boots. And therefore I got about 45 emails correcting me that the mud and the weather has nothing to do with why in Skver they wear boots. It has to do with a different reason, which I'll mention in a second. And some of them were unnecessarily belligerent, but most of them were just nice and correcting that and clarifying it. So I want to clarify that I said the whole thing about Hasidic dress because I wanted to mention that it's a great topic, and I hope to get to it one day, the story of Hasidic dress. And the size of the socks and the pants and the boots and the shoes reminded me of it, and that's why I mentioned it. But in Skver, as in Chernobyl, the origin of the story, as I'll just quote one of the many letters I received of the Skver boots, was that Rabbi Yaakov Yosef became a grandchild in Belz by marrying Rabbi Yisachar Dov of Belz's granddaughter, and he lived there after his wedding. When someone came to Belz, they were expected to adhere to the Belzer dress code, and he didn't want to wear knickers and high socks. So he just, a few different versions that I received, but it seems that he preempted the problem by wearing boots on top of the socks, and therefore he always wore the boots, and it became the custom in Skver to wear the boots. And that's why in Skver they wear boots, because of this connection to Belz. But either way, the story about Hasidic dress is still a good story. Here's another letter I got, which I enjoyed, and I'm sure you will as well. Just listen to your latest podcast where you say offhandedly, I'm cynical about plenty of things, but not Hasidic garb. My Rebbe, a very American Talmud of Yeshiva Chavetz Chaim, once gave the example of the Skver boots in admiration for the way they connect the chassidim to the previous generations. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he compared it to Yitzchak Avinu naming the wells with the same name as Avraham named them, and Rabbeinu Bechaya there comments that it was for this same reason. But more importantly, I'm sure your listenership would appreciate an episode about the things that you are cynical about. So maybe we'll get to that one day. We'll have to find the right and appropriate platform for that to do a cynical episode. Here's one final one. Another letter, a short one. Reb Michal Twersky Shlita was asked, what kind of chassidim are the Twerskys? He said, we aren't chassidim, we are Rebbes. Very cute. So before we go into Kotzk and Izhbitz and the dispute between the two, so I just wanted to mention that in case you haven't gotten it already, which probably most of you have, but this week's Mishpacha magazine you definitely don't want to miss out on. Is a very, very interesting article. It happens to have been written by me, but the topic is a good topic, about Reb David Kamenetsky and the book that he authored on Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski. And a fantastic book, and I had the privilege of interviewing him and hearing about Reb Chaim Ozer and the book and the research and and of course about the author, Reb David, who's an impressive, amazing researcher and scholar and Talmud Chacham and very nice person as well. But the work that he did on Reb Chaim Ozer is a great book to have if you can get it. And it's a great article, if I might say so myself, so you want to see that. There's also in this week, once we're mentioning Mishpacha, the For the Record that I write together with Davi Safir is also a good story about the Ar Sameach and the alleged murder of the Ar Sameach, which he was not murdered, but there was rumors going around that he was during the post-mayhem of the revolution and the after World War I. So that's a good story as well. So you're going to want to check those two out, and of course, all the other fantastic articles in the magazine. In other news in Jewish history, again, before we get to cuss, there's just too much going on, so I have to share it with you. I recently received a historic video that doesn't quite rival the original video that we saw years ago of the Chavetz Chaim at the Knesset Gedolah of Agudas Yisrael in Vienna, but this is almost there. I think it's a close second place. This is in Camp Mesivta in upstate New York in 1942. And you see a video that was just recently discovered. You see Reb Shlomo Hyman, the Rosh Yeshiva Tarvadas, walking. I think you see Reb Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, if I'm not mistaken. And Reb Yisrael Chaim Kaplan, the Mashgiach, the Rosh Yeshiva Mashgiach in Beis Medrash Elyon. And so that's also a historic video that was just discovered. And and mentioned the Chofetz Chaim. So there's also a new picture of the Chofetz Chaim that was just discovered. Seemingly the Chofetz Chaim, hard to know exactly. So lots of Jewish history things going on. It's always good to keep abreast of the latest discoveries. But we have to get to Kotzk. And Kotzk, always so fascinating. I miss Kotzk. I miss going to the city of Kotzk, to the Kotzker's kever, and also to go to Ishbitz and the Ishbitzer's kever. And so instead of the trips, we'll just talk about them a little bit. Last year, on the Kotzker's yard site, almost a year ago, we had stories of the Kotzk and a bit of his background. In the last couple of minutes, I managed to get into the story of what's called Yena Leil Shabbos, that Friday night, that Leil Shabbos, which we'll find out today in more in depth if it happened altogether, which it probably didn't, but it definitely became part of the legend and the mystique of this whole story, this whole episode of Kotzk and Izhbitz. So I also mentioned it in passing on the Ishbitz episode, and I mentioned it in passing on the Ger succession episode. So I did mention a few times. I just wanted to be able to go more in depth this time. Like I said on those other times, the chassidim in Poland would say, "Der was weiß sagt nicht, und der was sagt weiß nicht." The ones who know don't say, and the ones who say don't know. So if I'm going to go ahead and say, that means I don't know. And if I don't say, that means I do know. So I definitely don't know. So just to give a few different versions of what happens to try to piece together what exactly was there. There's been so much. I mean, there's very few figures. And I guess the Baal Shem Tov, probably Rav Menachem of Breslov, but the Kotzker is one of those who's one of the most written about Hasidic leaders in the history of the movement. Yehuda Leib Levin, of course, has Beis Kotzk. It's an internal Ger version of events. There's Meir Urian's book of Hasne Bayer Bekutz, the bush, the burning bush in Kotzk. Of course, Abraham J. Heschel, who wrote about Kotzk in Yiddish, because he said the only way to understand Kotzk is in its original language. Martin Buber wrote a lot of things that never happened in Kotzk, but he thought they did, so he wrote that. Menashe Unger has a book which is about Kotzk, and Dr. Joseph Fox, Yitzchak Alfasi, Simcha Raz. It goes on and on and on and on. All great books. And of course, there's Torah. There's the Ayol Torah. There's Emes Ve'emuna, which is the most popular. And then there's Amud HaEmes, which Rav Yitzchak Meir Alter before the war put out. And many, many more books and articles about it. I remember sometimes going to these bookstores and book sales and wondering, should I go ahead and buy another one? And I'm not going to read all of the books on Kotzk. I have a few that I've read, and it's just too hard to keep up with all of them. There's other topics, believe it or not, that are interesting as well. So in the years of isolation, we know that the Kotzker spent the last 20 years of his life in pretty much isolation. We'll talk about that also. How much was he isolated? Was he completely isolated, or was it not? But he definitely was somewhat isolated. And the question is, how is there a Kotzker Chassidus after that? The Rebbe is not around. And we know that the whole way that the court of a Rebbe, the court of a tzaddik works, is the relationship between the Rebbe and his chassidim. And here, the chassidim, for the most part, the Rebbe is inaccessible. He's secluded. How do they grapple with that? So there's a very interesting testimony that I heard from the late Dr. Tzipi Kaufman. She brought out from the sefer that was written at the time by a chassid of the Kotzker, Meir Tzvi of Zamush, and he writes there. Again, this is a free translation. This is not the original Hebrew. I have lived in close proximity to the Rebbe for several years now. For some years already, my thoughts have not left the Rebbe for a moment. Rather, my heart is constantly bound up with him with cords of love, the Avaisis Ava, and his image is before me that I might obey him for his service and performing his bidding in Avodas Hashem. Nevertheless, I have countless matters in the depths of my heart, that I myself know not whether they originate with the right side of truth or chas v'shalom, the left side of falsehood, nor whom I might turn to ask. I could say, I shall go to the Ish Elikim, the Rebbe, and place my matter before him, and he shall surely judge me, for he is the teacher among the Jewish people. But all this time, his guidance is in the form of Hester Panim, owing to our many sins. And for this reason, my innards perish within me. I know not what to do. An amazing, amazing testimony. That's why I wanted to read it, because it's, even though you lose some of it in the translation into English, that here's someone who's a chassid of the Kotzker, and he is struggling. He doesn't know what to do because his Rebbe is secluded. He's inaccessible. What do? He can't maintain a relationship with the tzaddik, with the Rebbe, and he's definitely a Kotzker chassid to see how he's grappling if it's truth or falsehood, which is the classic Kotzker dilemma, with the striving for pure truth, and that's how, an interesting way of how the Chassidus manages to continue even afterwards, is that there's this yearning to go see him, and there's somehow he becomes the Rebbe of himself. The Chassid becomes his own Rebbe. Now, the truth of the matter is that the Chiddushei Harim, Izhbitzer Meir, the first, who would become eventually the first Ger Rebbe, he sort of managed the court during the years of the Kotzker's conclusion. Of course, there was the Kotzker's children, and he wasn't that secluded, which we'll get to also. But this letter kind of brings us into the story. Now, last time when we spoke about the Kotzker, we spoke about his biography a little bit, that he had gone to the Chayz of Lublin, and then he left the Chayz as already he was young. He was already a married teenager, but he was young, and he went with the Yid HaKadosh, Rav Yitzchak to Pshischa, and in 1827, when the Yid HaKadosh, the holy Jew of Pshischa, passed away, so he followed Reb Simcha Bunim of Pshischa. 1812, the Yid HaKadosh passed away, and then Reb Simcha Bunim took over. In 1827, Reb Simcha Bunim passed away, and most of the Pshischa chassidim followed the Kotzker to Tomashov and then to Kotzk. And during the years of his leadership, when he was with the chassidim, so I mentioned last year many stories. Of course, there's more stories and sayings. The Kotzker was a master of the one-liner. He had the best one-liners in history, and a lot of them had a lot of depth to understand them. He once said about the Pshischa custom of davening late, which some within the Hasidic world were not happy about, and definitely those outside of the Hasidic world were not happy about. So he said, we serve Hashem while others serve the Shulchan Aruch. That was the Kotzker's line. We're serving Hashem. We have to be prepared to serve Hashem. You can't just get up in the morning and serve Hashem. You need hours and hours of preparation, and then you could do it. The others, they serve the Shulchan Aruch. It says in the Shulchan Aruch to do it. Now, of course, you can't take just that at face value, because obviously the Shulchan Aruch is in the service of Hashem too. I once quoted this Kotzker when I was on a trip. I was giving a tour, and it was to a yeshiva, and the Rebbe of the yeshiva was with his students, and I was the tour guide. And I said, we were in Kotzk, and I said over this story. And afterwards, the Rebbe pulled me over to the side, and he said, do you ever want to be a tour guide for this yeshiva again? I said, I would love to. So he said, don't ever say that story again. So I almost got fired for saying this story. So apparently it's controversial. The Kotzker was like Pshischa, but Kotzk was Pshischa to the extreme. So he wasn't impressed. I mentioned this last year about the miracles, the maifsim that other Rebbes would do, and he would very had a play on the words. He would say oisais umaifsim ba'admas b'nei cham. The miracles, the maifsim, are admas b'nei cham. They belong to the non-Jewish world. They don't magic and that's not for us. He was being quite critical of that approach. He was, they collected all his sayings, and eventually, years and years after his passing, they collected it and published it into Svarim, which people study today, and there's commentary written on it, but he himself never wrote. He wrote, and he would burn his writings. He never even prepared for publishing. Someone asked him why. He said, why should I write Svarim? So people should What are they going to do with it? During the week, no one has time to learn from Sfarim because they're busy with work, they're busy with family, with all kinds of mundane things. So the only time they have to learn is on Shabbos. So they're going to open a sefer on Shabbos. When are they going to do it on Shabbos? They're busy in shul, they're davening, they're eating, the Suda. The only time they have to open a sefer on Shabbos is after the cholent, on Shabbos afternoon. Now what's going to happen after the cholent? They're going to fall asleep. So am I going to publish a sefer so that people can fall asleep on it? So he didn't publish any Sfarim. One time a chassid came to him and said, I need Parnasa. Now the Kotzker did not like when chassidim came to him and asked him about Parnasa. Unlike almost every tzaddik of his day, who felt it was their responsibility to assist, to daven for the chassidim, for their Parnasa and everything. The Kotzker, he said, you come to me, we're coming to serve Hashem. We're coming to seek truth. We're coming to, like I said last year, to scream from the rooftops. Hashem hu Elokim. We're not here to be concerned about the material world and mundane physical things like making a living. So he said to him, but a chassid still came to him and said, I need a parnasa. So the chassid said, is that your biggest problem? He said, yes, that's my biggest problem. My wife and children are going hungry. So the chassid said, so then go ahead and daven. So the chassid responds, I don't know how to daven. So the Kotzker looks at him and says, so Parnasa is not your biggest problem if you don't know how to daven. And one of the best lines that I could endlessly say over cite the Kotzker is what he said about mimicking someone else and being your own person. Don't be what someone else is that he said, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not I, and you are not you. But if I am I, because I am I, and you are you, because you are you, then I am I, and you are you. And that really brings out, I think it summarizes it. And with that all in mind, we can come to the story of what happened. What was the breakdown? What was the crisis in Kotzk? There was opposition to the way of Kotzk. The tzaddikim in Galicia and Sadiger, the Rizhiner, were opposed to the way of Kotzk. The Rizhiner actually still in Rizhin at the time. He was too radical. He was too dismissive. He was too different. He had a different approach, and there was growing opposition within the Hasidic world to the way of Pshischa originally, and especially to the radical way of Kotzk and what was going on there. So we come to the year 1839, 1840, and the year 1840 needs its own episode. Today it has its own website and its own podcast and its own everything, but it also needs its own story, because a lot of things happened in 1840 from a Jewish history point of view. But the story of Kotzk also happened really in 1839, but it was the Jewish year of Tuf Reish, which is associated with 1840, because most of the year was 1840. So what was happening in Kotzk is that the Kotzker, and he was trying to bring along his chassidim, were reaching for ideals that were impossible for the chassidim, a search for pure truth, to reconcile all the contradictions in the world, in the mystical world, in the philosophical world, in Chassidus, in the Torah, and everything, and to be completely unconcerned with the mundane of life, and to only be striving for perfection. And he wasn't getting that responsiveness from the Chassidim. The Chassidim were coming to him for brachas, and the Chassidim were still concerned about their families and their livelihood, and even he himself was having a challenging time reconciling everything, to reach this perfection and these ideals. And he had some very close chassidim. His closest chassidim were Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner, who was the Ishbitzer. He became the Izhbitzer. And he ran the Beis Medrash. He was like the Rosh Yeshiva, I guess we could call it. It wasn't an official yeshiva, of course, but the chassidim who hung around the Beis Medrash, he was in charge. He gave the shir, if there was a shir, or he answered the questions. He was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. There was Rav Yitzchak Meir, the Ger Rebbe, eventually Rav Yitzchak Meir Alter. He had a different last name at the time. And he was eventually, with the Kotzker's second marriage, he was his brother-in-law. And there was also Reb Hersh Tomashover, who lived in Kotzk, actually. He was there all the time. The other ones came and went. He was the closest, like the associate. He was like a secretary. He took care of him. And there was other, close chassidim, Reb Chil Meir of Gastinen and Reb Chana Chenech of Alexander. There was other close chassidim, and there was the core group, and then there was the many chassidim who came and went, who visited. Sometimes they stayed, they hung around, made a l'chaim. The Beis Medrash in Kotzk, where the Kotzker's house was adjacent to, so there was the Hasidic regulars, and then there was visitors who would come. There's actually a song that we have till today, a Yiddish song that the visitors to Kotzk would sing when they would go in their wagons, and their horse and wagons to Kotzk, and it was like the description was like a pilgrimage to the Beis HaMikdash, and going to Kotzk was equated with going to the Beis HaMikdash. Apparently, many people would come. Apparently, there was the descriptions are of thousands of people coming. So the Kotzker's troubles continue, and he goes into a certain depression because his ideals weren't being met, and his chassidim weren't reaching what he expected out of them. There was not enough of this pure truth. He tried to get rid of the chassidim. He tried to get rid of the masses coming to him because he didn't want any compromises. There's always a question in the Hasidic movement: was it founded for the masses, which is the common conception, or was it founded for the elite, which would surprise many, and that really deserves a topic of its own? But it was a little bit of both. There were many times in the history of the Hasidic movement where it was very clear that this was a very elitist approach, notably the Baal Shem Tov himself, who didn't found the movement. He never intended to, and the movement developed after his passing, which I spoke about another time. But the Kotzker for sure was like that. By the way, on the other hand, the assumption always is that the Lithuanian Torah world, the Beis Medrash of the Vilna Gaon and his students were elitist. And the Hasidic movement was for the masses. It's to a certain extent the stereotype is true, but to a certain extent it could even be described as the opposite, because you look through the Nefesh HaChaim, he's describing how he's criticizing the Hasidic ideal that everything has to be lishma, and the study of Torah has to be lishma, for its pure, only for its pure sake and not for any other ulterior motive. And the Nefesh HaChaim says, no, anyone can do it. It's for everyone. The study of Torah is even shaloi lishma, and it's for everyone. And it seems to be that he's talking to the masses, whereas the Hasidic leaders who are saying, no, everything has to be pure, and the Taras HaMachshava, and it's all for Dveikus and everything. So it's a very high mystical ideal, which very few, only the elite can get to. All right, either way, so without getting into it, and again, it's a topic that needs a lot more development, so that's for another time. But in Kotzk, it definitely was for an elite, and the masses were coming to him, and he didn't like it. He didn't want to compromise. So what happens is that it comes to a head, and according to many versions of the story, it happened on Yenel Shabbos, which may not have ever happened. This Shabbos story may have happened. And there was this confrontation. The Kotzker on this Shabbos, this Friday night, according to the story, that it happened on Shabbos. So he broke down. There was some sort of breakdown. Afterwards, there was both maskilim who were anti-Hasidic, and they used this rumor, this story as good, fuel for the fire against their war against the Hasidic movement in the 19th century, and Hasidic groups that opposed Kotzk, such as Ishbitz, such as some of the groups in the groups in Galicia. They said all kinds of stories that happened, that the Kotzker did things that were inappropriate. It was Shabbos, and he said things that were blasphemous or borderline apikorsis, and he screamed out less din, less dayan, and there's all kinds of rumors. It's unsubstantiated. There's no sources from the time period that anything like that happened, and it seems to have been mixed up, actually, fascinatingly enough, with a different story, a completely different story that happened 30 years later, because the first sources of the story only appeared 40, 50 years after it happened. And you see that had gotten mixed up with another story where it did happen, similar story, where the Rizhiner's son, right, I've spoken about him several times, Bernio of Liova, who was a Hasidic Rebbe who left his chassidim, and he joined Maskilim in Chernovitz until he was brought to his brother in Sadiger a couple of months later. But those type of stories did happen with him, something about Shabbos and something about things he said publicly to the chassidim, to his family, to whatever. So they transposed those sayings and that story onto the Kotzker. But what it is clear is that it's no smoke without a fire. Something did happen, and he had some sort of breakdown. He reached a boiling point where he couldn't handle it anymore, and he couldn't keep it inside, and he either had a nervous breakdown or he fell into a complete depression, and he wasn't able to function anymore as a Rebbe. And whether that happened on this Shabbos or at a different point is debatable. We don't know exactly when it happened. There's a whole story that it happened on Shabbos Parshas Toldos, that he suffered a breakdown, and he got sick, and he spent the entire winter and almost the whole next year in bed, sick, until he recovered. And during that time, he remained secluded, already cut off from the chassidim at that point, even before his big isolation afterwards. And it was during that time that Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner gathered a large gathering of chassidim around him, because he was around and he was the leading chassid, and he also felt that there's different approaches to leadership. Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner did not like it that the Kotzker was slowly cutting himself off from his chassidim, was becoming more distant in the time leading up to the Yenel El Shabbos, to that Leil Shabbos, before the Kotzker's breakdown. And the Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner felt that the chassidim needed a leader, and the Kotzker wasn't leading because he was too demanding, and he was too isolating himself, and he was too dismissive of the chassidim's mundane needs. And the Kotzker said, we can't compromise. And the Mordechai Yosef Leiner said, it's not a compromise, it's leading the chassidim for who they are. And this was a dispute about leadership, about what the proper approach to leadership is. Do we compromise? Do we allow the purity of the truth in Kotzk to be watered down to cater to the needs of the chassidim? And the Kotzker said no. And the Mordechai Yosef Leiner, the Ishbitzer, said yes. And during the time when the Kotzker is not around, so Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner got more popular because the chassidim were attracted to him. He was there for them. That coming Simchas Torah after this happened, so customarily Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner would get the 6th hakafa, which in the Hasidic circles was the most desired hakafa, and he understood that he was not going to be getting it that year because of the growing distance between the two. The Kotzker had heard that Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner was becoming in his place a leader in his own town, in his own beis medrash, in a place where he was. So he made his own hakafas in a different part of the neighborhood, in a different part of town, and he left Kotzk forever after Simchas Torah. So it started on a Shabbos, probably Shabbos Parshas Toldos, and a year later, the final break between Ishbitz and Kotzk happened on Simchas Torah. Now, like I said, that's the basic gist of what happened. There's different versions of how the details were. Like I said, the Maskilim and the ones who opposed Kotzk and later opposed Ger, they wanted to say much more extreme versions of what happened, which, like I said, is probably untrue. There aren't any real good sources for it. And it's probably a confusion with the Bernio Friedman story of Liova, which happened 30 years later. And there's even a very sharp, we know that there was something. One of the only primary sources that we have from the time is a letter from the Ger Rebbe, from the Chiddushei Harim. And he writes this very sharp letter. Now, he writes in there that these evil people are spreading rumors about the Kotzker, about what happened. And it's lies, it's not true. And nothing of the sort happened. Everything's normal here in Kotzk. I was just there for Shabbos, and everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about. And the Kotzker even came out, the Rebbe came out, and he spoke to he was there. He participated in the Shabbos. I mean, he was trying to dispel the rumor even of his isolation. But it's clear that something happened, because the fact that he was trying to dispel those rumors meant, and especially that he had to be so sharp about it, which was very not much his nature. Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner, he felt, and he said this to the chassidim when they were waiting for the Kotzker to come out, and he wouldn't come out because he was, going through his thing. The Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner said, the sulam has to be mutzav arza, even if it's reishai magia hashamayma. The ladder has to be grounded. It has to be on the eretz. It has to be in this world. It has to be with the chassidim, even if it's reishai magia hashamayma. Even if you're up in the heavens, even if you're so lofty and you have the lofty ideals, you need to lead. You need to be with the chassidim as a leader. We're not angels. We're human beings. Which is an interesting point, which substantiates the fact that this Yenel Shabbos, that Leil Shabbos, took place on the time of Parshas Toldos and Vayetze, because the Torah that Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner and the Ishbitz and in Kotzk, both sides of the dispute, used Torah from the Parsha of Toldos and Vayetze to support their position. In Ishbitz, they said this whole thing of Sulam Mutzav Arza, and they said more. He said, the Ishbitzer said, Yakov was Vayetze. He left. Vayetze Yakov mi Beersheva, Vayelech Harani. He left. His father and his grandfather Avram and Yitzchak were just spiritual. They were totally spiritual. They lived in the upper spheres, in the upper worlds. But Yaakov, he had to deal with the mundane. He had to deal with the world of Lavan. So he left. So he was describing his own leaving, that he had to leave because, sometimes there needs to be a leader who deals with the mundane needs of the chassidim as well. Whereas in Kotzk, and specifically in Sachachav, a grandson of the Kotzker, he said that tzaddik sometimes is too holy to be with the people. So sometimes he has to hide and be isolated and be secluded from the people. And he said Yaakov Avinu was isolated from the world for 14 years because the world couldn't handle his light, and because he can't handle the world. So the same thing here. My grandfather, the Kotzker, was isolated. He was cut off from the world for 20 years because the world couldn't handle his light, and he wasn't able to handle the world. One of the times he came out of his isolation, he said, "The Welt stinkt," the world stinks, and he went back into his room. Now, there's a lot written about their Torah approaches, the differences in their Torah approach between the Kotzk and then Ger approach, and their philosophy and outlook and worldview, and especially the Ishbitz worldview and Torah. There's loads written about. There's Sfarim and doctorates and everything, whatnot. Of course, I'm not going to delve into that because it's not my forte. I don't know much about it. But I recently got a letter writer. Someone told me that I do an injustice by focusing just on the history and not on their thought or philosophy or their Torah. So I guess you have an injustice being done to you. You'll have to listen to another podcast. You'll have to listen to a Torah podcast as well, because I'm not equipped to deal with that. One of those who left with the Izhbitzer was Reb Leibel Eger. Reb Leibel Eger was a grandson of Reb Kiva Eger, who joined the Hasidic movement. First he came to Kotzk, but his reception to Kotzk was so unwelcoming that he didn't feel it was for him, and eventually he left with Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner to Ishbitz. When he came, he was from an aristocratic rabbinic family with substantial financial means, and he came dressed well with a nice hat. And Kotzk, they didn't go for yichus, they didn't care about materialism or yichus or anything. So the first thing they did was knock off his hat. Then they started making fun of his yichus. Oh, your father's Reb Shlomo Eger and your grandfather's Reb Kiva Eger, and they started making fun of him. And he couldn't deal with it. He couldn't handle it. He couldn't handle the sharp truth of Kotzk and their manhandling. So he goes with Ishbitz. That's one of A lot of the chassidim did. Most of the chassidim did. David Bashevkin, all the chassidim, they go with the Ishbitzer, and they become chassidim of Ishbitz, but there are a substantial amount that stay in Kotzk as well. And the Kotzker at that time, when Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner leaves, he decides he's not coming out. He's secluded. He stays in isolation. And there's, of course, rumors about that. Was this isolation? It remains for 20 years till he passed away, almost 20 years later, in 1859. Was it voluntary or was it forced? So the ones who interpret Yenel Shabbos and say that there was something blasphemous that took place and something with the Shabbos candles that took place, so they'll say, he was forced into isolation. The Hirsch, Thomas Shaver, and the Chiddushei Harim forced him into isolation because they were scared. What's he going to say and what's he going to do? So they had to put up a front. But again, that's questionable sources. So it seems that it was voluntary. He decided voluntarily to go into isolation. And then the other question is that was it a partial seclusion or was it complete? And it also, for many years, it was believed that he was completely secluded from the world. It seems that that's also not true. He used to have interactions with his family members quite regularly. He would study with his grandchildren. He interacted with his children, with his wife, his kids, very regularly, and with his close chassidim. The Chiddushei Harim went in pretty regularly, and the Kotzker himself would come out occasionally, several times a year, to the Beis Medrash, to the chassidim, to the masses who would be waiting for him. So it seems that even the seclusion was only partial and not total. By the way, when we go to Kotzk, there's a house that most tour guides point out as his house, and this is the house where he was secluded, he was isolated from the world for 20 years, and they stand outside his house. So the house was owned by a member of the Morganstern family at some point. The only issue with this myth is that the house was built after the Kotzker's passing, like well after. So it's unlikely that he would have been in that house. Now the animosity continues for generations, for years, both from the Galicia chassidim and from Ishbitz, which became Radzin afterwards. There was this sharp divide between the house of Kotzk, which became Ger, and Sokolov, and Sachatshav, and several other Biala, and several other branches of Polish Hasidus. And that animosity continued because of the events surrounding that Leil Shabbos and the breakdown of the Kotzker and the divide, the dispute about the leadership between Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner, the Izhbitzer, and his Rebbe, the Kotzker, and it lasted pretty much until the Second World War. So that's a little bit about, again, about the Kotzk and Izhbitz dispute. This was Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sponsorships, lectures, sources, virtual tours. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.